Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. I'm joined today by Red Pill Mentor. Things will be interesting because he's been in Japan for quite some time to talk about certain issues as they concern the sexes. Um, Before we even get into talking about Japan, I'd be interested just to find out approximately your age, and to be too precise, and also how you discovered stuff in the manosphere.
Okay, so well, first off, Stardust, thanks for taking this time to talk to me, and really appreciate it. And so my age, approximately lower 30s, and regarding, I guess, my coming to become knowledgeable about the manosphere and the red pill. It actually originally started when I was in the middle of university out here in Tokyo, and I had a philosophy teacher who had a bit of an old paper that went into the questioning of the morality of marriage. And ever since I read that paper, I became very curious as to the inner workings of the relationship between the sexes. And that basically was the catalyst in my taking to YouTube and finding out about various people such as yourself.
Mm. So you were studying in Japan. Interesting.
Yes, originally I was military, and then after I got done with that, after about somewhere around 6 years, I went back to the States for a little bit and then started to think, well, do I want to remain in the US or do I want to go back to Japan? And for me, it was a pretty simple decision just to go back.
What do you, I mean, you say it was a simple decision. It's always interesting when I hear things like that. What would you say was simple about it? Why was it just sort of an easy decision to make, would you say?
So for me, living in the States, East Coast suburban life, nothing too spectacular. And even just as a child, I had generally wanted to travel to Japan, but I was pretty much open to going anywhere.
Mm, that's fair enough. So you hear this lecture and you start getting interested in this stuff, and I guess that's how the whole rabbit hole started for you.
Definitely, it definitely asked some different question about was it was it a quote unquote good thing to get married, or a lot of things that we kind of I think take for granted and we just kind of assume, well, like you said in previous videos, monkey see monkey do, and that definitely does seem to be the common theme, is that everyone kind of repeats what people around them do. And I guess because it facilitates a comfort zone and people generally don't go outside of that, it just seems like the easy option. Or you might have family who kind of pushes you into going in this direction out of their own self-interest.
Yeah, most social conventions, not just marriage, but most social conventions are imitative. You just, yeah, monkey see, monkey do. This person got married. This person, got this type of house. I think, obviously, it's different in different cultures, but in the U.S. in particular, there's probably a stronger undercurrent of sort of keeping up with the Joneses. So there's even more of this idea that you should be buying and engaging in activities as other people, which is not to say it doesn't happen other places. Obviously, places like Japan and my own experience in South Korea, they're highly conformist, but it's kind of different, if you know what I mean. It's not the same type of, it's a different type of imitation.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Specifically here in Japan, I mean, the level of collectivism and conformity, it's pretty intense. I mean, even in a standard Japanese work environment, you may have the boss that, say, decides to stay after work for whatever reason, and to not be a burden, a lot of people will generally just follow suit and just stay after with them. And this is generally just what everyone does, and they don't really question it.
Yeah, which is a different type. It's sort of built in the culture after many centuries. It's pretty similar in South Korea, in my experience, although I've heard it's changed in the last 10 years. Whereas in the West, especially in the United States, I wouldn't say it isn't this the conformity of bowing and necessarily following orders from your superiors to the best of your ability, but it's a bit more subtle. But doing marriage increasingly, probably less so. But there are a whole bunch of social conventions that you're expected to follow in the United States in a Western environment that if you choose not to, um, I think increasingly it's okay. It's actually an interesting kind of offshoot of a topic, but originally years ago when manosphere content started online and YouTube, uh, MGTOW stuff, it was kind of a big deal to people. I don't like the term marriage strike, but people would think it was a big deal for you not to get married. Whereas, given just how tumultuous the sexual market is these days, not getting married doesn't seem to be a huge priority in a lot of people. It's certainly not in their 20s or even in their early 30s. It just seems that between the mass thottery and what have you, that the question of marriage is not a really big one. And that's my superficial impression. I haven't run data on this, but in keeping with the acceleration that we've experienced and witnessed in recent years, I get the sense that marriage is just not this thing that it used to be. Even amongst normies, as they're called, even amongst people who I would say are not particularly aware or red-pilled on certain issues. It's just sort of meh. So getting, which is interesting because a lot of the earliest currents of MGTOW were pretty much anti-marriage. But in keeping with all these things that are happening, it seems that there's a kind of universal decline in marriage. Well, definitely, I made a video about this. I mean, certainly the U.S. all-time low. People are just overall less interested, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Finances being a primary one. The insanity or the craziness of the current mating market, another contributing factor. Um, but I'd say that, in my experience, is no longer an argument you hear a lot. To get married or not, that seems almost archaic. Not that nobody gets married, obviously they still do. Um, it's just less of this almost axiom, I put it. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, no, I'll agree to an extent. I mean, I would say that a lot of this comes down to just, and we've definitely agreed on this in the past, that it definitely comes down to the financial aspect. I mean, there was a study that it was David Buss and some of his colleagues, and I believe it was called A Half Century of Women's Mate Preferences or something along those lines. And they looked at women's mate preferences ranging from 1939 to, I believe, 1996, about 57 years. And within this study, they found that women prioritize good financial prospect, as they termed it, throughout all those years. And this was something that actually was increasing. Now, more on that is that there was something termed the structural powerlessness hypothesis. And by the structural powerlessness hypothesis, they basically hypothesized that women only prioritize financial prospect and prospective mates due to them not having access to their own resources. However, after looking at this and seeing that over time, when they did get their own resources, that it only increased, this basically disproved the hypothesis. Um, so I would say, given this and different factors that have kind of amalgamated into what we see in contemporary society, women, they're not going to be potentially anywhere. I mean, people generally, they're not content, as you said, but they're not, specifically women are not anywhere near as content as maybe they may have been in the past, specifically with this whole factor such as the gender academic gap and women going into the academics and then prioritizing financial aspects, as well as education and prospective mates. This is just not conducive at all to women going into pair bonding situations.
Yeah, that's interesting that the study was falsified. It's one of the big claims that you'll hear from critics of evolutionary psychology is that it's all just so, and it's It's unfalsifiable. So essentially, it seems that the well, based on what you said, that it is basically hypergamy on offer here in the sense that if if women even with sufficient resources, well, I mean we've seen this actually, right? Actually, so-called college, university educated women, right? They're not going to mate down. Um, so they just want more. They want more than what they have. Um, though, I don't think this has been studied in academia terribly much, but one thing that I've often considered is that women, unlike men, obviously have this other consideration with pregnancy and lactation, and all that. And so this issue of finding a man of sufficient resources, I think at least in some cases now it can kind of be delayed, in the sense that women are just as interested in looks as men are. It's just that they have to partition their interests and find some sort of balance. But if you're making tons of money, I think Pokemon is sort of the thought of choice, I guess. I think she's worth something like 2 million. I don't know. Then I would imagine that obviously long term you want somebody who's quote unquote just as successful. But finding someone with the same amount of money, at least in, what is sometimes referred to as short-term mating strategies, is probably not as important. In fact, probably looks become just as important, if not as important, as they would be for men in that particular context. Assuming you have sufficient money. Obviously, again, long-term, women want to marry up, they want to mate up. They're not going to just accept some guy who works pumping gas, right? But nonetheless, I do think there's been some skew. I doubt this has been studied by academics. It's too new actually. Last 5 years, maybe tops, um, to see where this trend has been going. Because I think people often think that hypergamy is only based on money. It can be a number of things. It can be status. When they're young, for example, the guy who plays guitar who looks good, I mean, he's a status symbol too. Not necessarily a lot of money, but that can be an attractive prospect at the time, obviously. Um, so yeah, the this is something that oddly not many people in the manosphere talk about. But yeah, women are not particularly content. When that is cited, though, my sense is that the people who cite it are, for lack of a better word, traditionalists, or they value traditional things. And so when they talk about it, they cite that fact so as to incentivize women to sort of get back to the stove or whatever they envision. I don't know exactly. This idea that if you only went back to this, then you'd feel a lot better. But myself, I question the viability of traditional setups in the current atmosphere because temptation uh, lurks in every corner. There are some examples people cite say, amongst the Amish or maybe Quakers and some odd religious sects, but I think by and large, the traditional setup wouldn't work given all the environmental and external pressures, especially online. Uh, what woman would actually, I mean, in every case I've borne witness to of women who go down the traditional route, they end up being just dissatisfied, because they settle down early or whatever. I mean, so at least they believe themselves to be dissatisfied, and so a lot of them fall to temptation. So
Definitely, I agree. And this goes into it gets deep in the research. This goes into what we've seen. Firstly, there is the good gene sexual selection theory, and by the good gene sexual selection theory, it posits that women will basically select for guys that are of good genetic quality. Is not to say that the long-term strategy, i.e., the male that can provide resources, is not valuable. Just that specifically for genetic material and reproductive reasons, they will be inclined towards selecting this type of. And of course, given the current environment, or really any environment, there aren't enough guys of, I guess, what we would colloquially term our chads. There aren't enough of this type of guy, and of course, the most optimal situation would be for a woman who could bag a chad who's also rather wealthy.
Yeah.
But it's not to say that that would actually make her content in any way. She might look at something else online and be artificially, inclined to view their current mate as not very valuable. And there has been research on this. Actually, it's been found amongst women that say they are already in a pair bond and someone of higher status comes along, that already will induce some discontent in said female. There's also the to compound with that, there's a hypothesis regarding sperm retention, where basically it's hypothesized that the female orgasm is meant to facilitate the uptake of sperm, but more specifically, women are more inclined to have orgasms with higher status men, and this is also helped by women seeing other women take interest in this male. So there was one study that looked at it presented women with three pictures, and it was a male, and in one of the pictures he would be by himself, in another one he would be surrounded by women, and in another one he'd be surrounded by men. And lo and behold, the women were attracted to the male surrounded by women, and seems to be just a evolutionary derived symbol vetting strategy that women can utilize in order to tell whether a man has value. So on top of that, we go move on to David Buss's mate switching hypothesis. And the mate switching hypothesis is a fairly recent hypothesis that more so focused on women, in that our primary strategy with regards to pair bonding is to basically mate switch. And by this, we take into account a lot of stuff that we talk into the manosphere. Actually, it actually seemed like he was actually listening to manosphere related content, and he just said, I have the inspiration to write now, because it goes into basically women, even in happy relationships, having this cognitive ability to basically just keep filtering through prospective mates in comparison to her own status and in comparison to the mate that she already has. And it's thought that women already have some type of cognitive manifestation that facilitates this at all times. So all this put together, it definitely does seem the case that yes, women, they're not meant to be content in any sense, and especially in this contemporary milieu.
But what put a sort of stopgap on this in an ancestral environment where just a couple dozen individuals, there's only so much you can reach for, and there's only so much you can see. Um, this is why I think that might have been very adaptive back in the day, but um, in today's atmosphere and today's environment, it's just where you're interconnected by the billions. I don't see why this would be an effective strategy because I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, wanting a higher status mate, wanting something quote unquote better than what you already have, sure. But if all you are is a 5 or 6, the likelihood that you're going to see, this is the problem. This is the asymmetry. Um, I mean, everyone ultimately typically engages in a sort of mating, like attracts like, but women much more so than men. I mean, a 5 or 6, just like a 9 or 10, thinks that she deserves a 9 or 10, even though that's well outside of her reach. And for the most part, most women fall into some category of average. So this just seems to be a completely misfired adaptation in the current environment because it's going to get. I mean, they're not hardwired to be particularly content to begin with, but the further compounding of that by the environment we live in, just nobody, obviously, no one's going to talk about this. Yeah, I've read a bunch of things by Buss. Most importantly, the big Evo Psych book that he produced. But this doesn't seem to be of the stuff that I do pay attention to. It doesn't seem that they're really picking up on that. That you're going to have almost necessarily a problem in an interconnected world of billions of people, and even if not, still tens of thousands of individuals in your quote unquote local environment. They're all presenting options that didn't exist in an ancestral environment, or even a few hundred years ago. And I think that's a huge contributing factor in the quote unquote discontentment of women. And I don't think that even has a solution. How, I'm not really sure how you would frame that. You know, maybe a woman's in a marriage and she's found a guy who's maybe a notch or two higher, but then experiences or sees something even better. How do you assuage a female like that? I have no idea, and I don't think it's even remotely possible. It's which is, I think, one of the big reasons. There are a lot of reasons, obviously. Women probably not only are not, but can't be content in this environment because with the at least perceived choice, this sort of hyper real, the well, there is no guy who's good enough, basically, which is the whole joke about Superman, right? I mean, it's just he's not good enough. There needs to be something even better than that. Um, and of course, women losing track of even if they are attractive, their long-term prospects in the sense that, I mean, well, people don't like hearing this, but the well does defeat them all eventually, to some degree. They're not going to have the same prospects at 35, 45 that they did at 25 or 20. Um, so yeah, it's uh, it's a gigantic mess. And I mean, I know you're interested in evolutionary psychology. I'm curious how you, in particular, got interested in that. Just because when you talk to people about it, again, it's always dismissed as sort of just so stories, rather than things that can be falsified. You know, I have a hypothesis. You can test it in some cases, and yeah, I'm curious how you got into it and if you ever try to engage people with it, because I think it's the key to understanding a lot of this. If you just look at the proximate, you just look at the current environment, you're not going to get good explanations for why things are happening the way they are and why humans are behaving the way they are, especially women and men for that matter. So,
No, yeah, and just quickly, just regarding the this part that doesn't really seem to make sense, and I definitely understand. And potentially it could be that in ancestral dangerous environments, the woman would be more so inclined to just jump into a relationship with a guy, but then also, smaller tribe, it's pretty obvious who the top person is, so there really isn't any mistaking that you can't get with the top person in that situation. Just as a thought, but my original interest, yeah, like I said, that philosophy paper, and also what kind of expedited the process was that I was living with a Japanese girl. I lived with her for about a year and a half, and I was noticing things about her behavior. Go figure, and just how some things weren't incongruent, and how some ways she would behave, and then that just kind of led me down further down the rabbit hole, and just kind of getting more so engaged in the whole evolutionary psychology realm. With regards to engaging people, I do this actually to a probably some people say a bit of an extreme extent. I remember when I got my bachelor's degree, my mother came out to Japan
do
to
you
visit
mind
with some
if I
family
just ask,
members.
sorry, what subject was it? A related subject or something different?
I studied psychology,
Okay, yeah,
so
okay, makes
when I
sense.
was in university, actually all of my papers and all my presentations were on the relationship to men and women, and you can imagine how awkward of an audience that generates.
Yeah.
Anywhere from complete silence to one girl screaming out like, what the f and things of that
Mm.
nature. They really didn't like that, talking about neoteny and the mimicking of this through makeup, and basically just shedding a light on a lot of female behavior and female nature. And women do not like this for obvious reasons. Even if they aren't cognizant of the inner workings of it, it being exposed and kind of taking away this whole, I guess we call feminine mystique, they really just do not take kindly to this. And going a bit further, yeah, when I graduated, my mother came out, and I had all this knowledge about just the relationship between men and women, and we started talking about hypergamy and some other related topics, and this kind of just kind of like opened my eyes to some things because she would just deflect and would just not be very willing to engage in a lot of the conversation. So with that, I mean, I figure, well, I'm going in the right direction.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people, for some reason, well, obvious reasons, I should say, female relatives, particularly close ones, siblings, mothers, etc., that they somehow think that they're exceptions or just don't really take them into consideration when in reality, if you set aside the blood relation there, which, for a lot of people is understandably difficult, um, you're basically just going to end up with a female who's going to behave like a female. In fact, if you pay attention, you set that aside, you can, and maybe retrospectively, certainly that in my own case, observing, female relatives, that things became very, very apparent years down the line. Obviously, when I was 10 or maybe 15, wasn't really cognizant of this stuff, but quite aware of it, what was going on, and also being able now to categorize some of these behaviors in ways that I certainly wasn't in a position to do so back then. But yeah, when you take away the blood relations and whatever fondness you have because you happen to be genetically related, you realize that women are women even when you're related to them. And they might treat you better on average than unrelated women, obviously, especially mothers and sisters, but they're still going to operate in those principles. I think women in particular don't like being unmasked, but in my experience, human beings in general, we're terrible at gauging ourselves and our instincts and our intuitions. And really, unmasking people in general, in my experience, produces, I would say negative results, but negative receptions, negative reaction. Women, especially, probably more so than men, but really getting to the nitty gritty of things. My personal pet peeve here, having dealt with a lot of the, I guess, I don't know what to call them, cultural warriors these days, is that there's this whole dynamic that's emerged probably in the last 20 years, I say, but really has been accelerated and expedited. That if you are a person, particularly on the left, and you want to present yourself as somebody who is educated and savvy, you need to at least say, look, I do believe in evolution, right? Because if you don't do that, then I don't know, you're the equivalent of some redneck who thinks Jesus is coming tomorrow or the next week or something like that. So you can't do that. But when you really quiz them and pin them down and try to engage them, it it turns out they don't really believe it had much of an impact. They're much more open to the idea of cultural mitigation, or just that everything is this weird circular thing where you're raised in a certain way and that produces effects. And um, and that to me is probably the best example of people who do, both men and women, but women more so, of people who don't really want to have a light shed on themselves, because I suppose sometimes uncovering these qualities and these traits can be unpleasant. But the way I look at it is they're there regardless. You might not want to think about it, but you're going to have to. You're acting out these things all the time as a human being, as a human ape. So you might as well pay attention and try to figure it out. That doesn't seem to jive well with a lot of people. And when you go even greater detail, things you've mentioned with neoteny and the, I call it the makeup war. I don't know, it's an interesting topic because basically every female, a lot of people would prefer not to, but then she's at a disadvantage compared to the females who do wear makeup. So that's why I call it
Right.
the makeup wars. But yeah, then it gets even worse because then you're trying to dissect into sort of group behavior, sexual behavior of a particular group acting in a certain way, even if it's just obvious and manifestly the case. Um, and well, I don't. You probably have encountered this resistance, but you'll be surprised the resistance. And when you try to bring up some simple things, simple truths, in fact, that typically a woman is not going to pick her husband up as a dishwasher or waiter, but the reverse happens all the time. I think the thing you sent me the other day, where the woman's this sort of lost drifter, but she's hot enough, so she gets the guy anyway. And I just when I hear stories like that or read that, I just have to. The most prominent example comes to mind is the Icelandic strongman Hafþór Björnsson, who encountered some random female in a diner in Canada who's something like 200 feet smaller than or shorter than he is,
Yeah.
and he just picked her up, and they're married and their kids on the way. I mean that I hesitate. Well, I don't hesitate. It doesn't happen the other way around. It just doesn't. I guess if the waiter's hot, she might, screw him or something like that. That could happen, but I mean, long-term prospects, probably not. And you point these things out, and I mean, what they inevitably end up doing is looking for exceptions or dismissing it. I think that's the whole issue that EvoPsych has in general, the resistance, and more broadly evolutionary biology. But EvoPsych is, well, in essence, EvoPsych is basically human ethology. I mean, ethology. Nobody has issues with describing bird behavior necessarily. I mean, they might disagree about some point, but nobody feels personally assaulted by it or offended. The thing about EvoPsych is basically it's a branch of ethology in the sense that it's describing animal behavior, but it's describing human animal behavior, and so that makes people feel really uncomfortable. Of course, what they're not paying attention to is even if it's not EvoPsych proper, there are all sorts of advertisers and marketing strategists who are taking advantage of our cognitive biases all the time in order to whatever it might be to bolster sales. I mean, in loot boxes in the gaming world, a perfect example. It's a somewhat separate topic, but it does take advantage of a native mechanism in our minds and our brains. So I personally I can't understand why people wouldn't want to understand this stuff since it's sort of describing them, but I can understand why they would in their place because sure it's much better to think that you're some completely autonomous agent that exists in a certain culture and you're shaping the culture and you can forget all the baggage that preceded you, millions of years. Um, I'm not too optimistic about pushing through either. In my early days on YouTube, I was very enthusiastic about the idea of sort of ramping up education at the lower levels of school and evolutionary theory in general, and then eventually getting to maybe Evo Psych. I don't think that's going to happen now. Um, at the time, maybe I was a little bit slightly more naive in the sense that I thought people might be more open to some of these ideas. But the closed-mindedness is astonishing, and uh, I think even within the manosphere, I think there's a kind of maybe not the same degree of hostility, although occasionally, but just a sort of eh, so what kind of attitude towards evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory in general. I don't know what you think about that, but
Yeah, I would say, and I can definitely respect that. I mean, I definitely have a great appreciation for a lot of YouTubers that they bring up the evolutionary research just because it's getting out there. I definitely think it's worth it to get all this information out there, like things like female ovulatory shift and all these great topics that can really validate a lot of the experiences that people have with regards to this contemporary sexual marketplace. I mean, you have guys that experience all these things, and I've definitely talked to plenty of them, even let some of them stay in my apartment when they were fresh out of a breakup, and just kind of explain some of these different topics, and it's definitely worth going into. With regards to women having the light shed on them, to me, at least in some of the cases, and it might be the majority of them, but I think definitely that having the light shed on them, and the reason that they are so inclined towards trying to utilize the whole navel deflection is because it's safer to have the guy think that, not all women are like this, because they can still derive benefits if guys are kind of just kept in the dark about their actual nature. Um, Even when they're committing to these acts, I mean, they're within the proximal realm, so that type of thinking, they're not actually thinking of the long term and the evolutionary implications, but they're thinking that I'm committing to this action in order to potentially get this benefit, and I see it to be in my best interest. So that's definitely going to be helpful. But yeah, definitely, stopping someone is, it would basically be an admission that I'm like this, and that's definitely not something that they would like to let out.
Yeah, what seems to be the contemporary strategy is to sort of, at least in theory, acknowledge some of these points when women engages, and then somehow present themselves as exceptions to this. Of course, inevitably they turn out not to be. I had an
Right.
encounter the other day with such a female who was saying how she wasn't like other women, she didn't get along with them, and blah blah. And then everything she said and her mannerisms, just frankly speaking, just smacked of, well, being a woman. Um, and Yeah, the funny thing is though, and this is probably me just being the pessimist, is that in my younger days, I was probably much more convinced that behind this idea of knowledge is power, and that if men were informed about this and had the information and the knowledge, they might act very differently in their interactions with women. Um, and I guess there's some element of that, probably, but I think that some guys, it just doesn't get through, and they're not going to necessarily uh, apply this or even take heed of this stuff. In my experience, uh, it's this probably an age gap as well. I've mentioned this several times now that the younger guys who don't have the experience, because humans very much operate off of experience, that it's very hard to concretize something that you don't know yourself. I mean, you can hear a description, you might know what to look out for. Maybe, I don't know, there's some deadly plant in a forest and you heard about what you're not really sure, versus you've actually encountered, or maybe even, I don't know, you've suffered from encountering it. I think that's that thing, that critical factor here. And I wonder, uh, what your thoughts on it, because you say you engaged a lot of people in this, and how they react to some of this knowledge and information. Do you actually feel that they try to incorporate it and take heed of it?
So one example that comes to mind, I remember I was talking to two females. There was one, a youthful Japanese woman, but she was getting a bit up there, and she was thinking, I need to go ahead and settle down. And granted, her logic was a bit backwards. She was saying that I want to have a kid, but I need to find a guy first. And she was at that time period. And then there was another woman who was recently married, and we got into a conversation about love, and they were just kind of like flinging the word around just all willy nilly, like they generally do. And then I brought up, well, there's a difference between male and female love. And then they started to listen in. And I basically brought up that, when we talk about love, we generally talk about love for the sake of loving. And then I went into like the difference between male and female love, the whole opportunistic versus the
Mhm.
whole, idealization of love. And one of the women, the one that had recently been married, her only response was basically a disgruntled face and saying, "I love my husband." So you have that, well, with regards to women, and that's pretty common. Generally, people, because the people that I'm around, they're all well aware of what I research. It's all I post on Facebook. It's all I basically look into. So they won't they won't very much argue back. They'll just kind of just go along with it. Um, so that was that case, and there was another case, like guys that I've like let stay at my apartment just to kind of inform them, and maybe because they were living with some girl and maybe she monkey branched, or maybe even he did something, but just to kind of put things into context from an evolutionary perspective, so they aren't just left in the dark because they're just living in the proximal realm. Um, I'll talk to these guys and I'll have them read certain things. Usually it all starts off with, and by the way, generally it's pretty successful. Generally they're pretty receptive. What they go on to do later with information is all their own, but generally they're very receptive. But I'll talk to them and kind of just make examples of just common instances that any guy would have with a woman, just regarding hypergamy and whatnot, and kind of like taking that from an evolutionary perspective and kind of like making examples that maybe they would have encountered within their own relationship, like maybe they've been talking to some other guy or something along those lines, and then Jen will say, "Huh, that actually makes a lot of sense. I didn't really think of it that way." And then I'll progressively kind of like move them into different realms of like the manosphere, just kind of starting all small and just kind of getting a taste. And after that, they generally get pretty interested because it's like someone's telling me something that the dynamic between the sexes, it's very ubiquitous, but not in this context, and one that actually makes it something that they can actually utilize in the future. So it definitely is very helpful, and a lot of guys definitely are very receptive. And sadly, it's generally right after a breakup. Sadly, I wish it wasn't that way. I wish a lot of guys were more receptive beforehand. Not to say it's not invariably so. Some guys are receptive beforehand, but generally it's after a breakup.
Kind of proves my point of experience that it's hard to conceptualize. I mean, you can conceptualize things, but concretizing them is, yeah, sometimes you need to go through certain things. You need to taste things, and someone can describe you the taste of a certain pizza. And I mean, it's a poor analogy necessarily, but yeah, you, yeah, because without an experience, I mean, you think about your past experiences with women, even your female relatives, and once you gain this knowledge, then you can sort of, oh yeah, that's what she was doing, or oh, I remember this. Without that, um, yeah, it's very difficult. There's just a sort of it's just this blank canvas. You're just hearing descriptions of things. Um, so probably that's actually just par for the course, I'd say. There's no way I would have come to where I am now if I hadn't had any experiences as a young person, um, because I wouldn't have gotten a sense of how women are and how they act and anything like that. So,
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I've definitely had multiple people tell me that basically because they didn't have any access to women before, people telling them that phrases such as like you generally say the juice isn't worth the squeeze, but if they've never actually even experienced it at all, and they have everyone around them kind of hyping the whole the value of it up, and presumably this is predominantly women as well, just kind of hyping it up and saying how great it is, and also other factors. And I think we actually kind of discount the effectiveness of this whole notion of the lonely old man that women generally project on the men. It's like, oh, you're going to get lonely if you're alone by yourself because she has a certain fertility window. Um, all these things kind of amalgamate together into men in a lot of cases feeling that they need to hurry up and get in a relationship and do all these things.
yeah, I mean, the lonely old man is kind of as a bait. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book. Um, there are so many negative scenarios that can occur and do occur in very old age that, wife or not, they're going to happen. And I'm not, I think that really, for a lot of guys, it strikes fear into their hearts because they hear this and then they think that not having quote unquote someone or some nagging old wife is going to fundamentally change something about them when they get older, and as if it's really going to help a lot. But you see some of these. I mean, you probably know better than most. I remember reading several articles of these women in Japan who were celebrating the deaths of their husbands because they could finally, I don't know, go on a cruise or take a proper
Ah, yeah.
holiday. A couple of those articles popped up in recent years, just sort of just counting down the time until he essentially drops dead. And I don't know the and also, as Chris Rock say it, people say life is short, but life is long, especially when you make poor choices. Yeah, there's no guarantee that getting married and that you're even going to make it that far. So that you're going to be, for example, if you get married at 30 or 35, that you're going to make it to the end of your life in an intact marriage is completely up in the air these days. It's just, yeah, and I think again, this is imitative in a lot of cases. People just they hear that, well, I don't want to end up like that. Like what? They don't even know what it is. They just hear something, they associate something negative with it, and that's enough to motivate them to try not to end up like that. Um, But
Yeah,
yeah,
with Japan, it gets even a bit worse than that because generally what ends up happening with a lot of families, well, so you always hear about, sexless Japan and whatnot, and people finding it to be a burden to even have sex within these relationships. But what has happened and what some research has shown is that basically the guy ends up becoming so estranged from the family because he's always out working. Apparently, in the past, it was actually to the point where the man would basically live at work. Like they would actually have set aside space or maybe even it going into the company budget where he would stay in a hotel or something like that nearby to constantly go to work, and then he maybe would go back to his wife at some point, but this wasn't a very constant thing. But for a lot of women, because the guy is so estranged, and I would say also because it's just the view of the man as inherently being a, what ends up happening is he ends up retiring at some point, and she basically just wants a divorce because he's been gone for so long, and she really has no feeling towards him. So she doesn't really want him there.
yeah. On the other hand, I mean, this is I mean, you'll hear similar. Well, we hear about these similar things in the West as well. That the wife complains that the husband's out working too much, basically supporting the family or doing what he has to do. But were he work less, then she wouldn't be able to live the entitled lifestyle that she wants to have. So there's no free lunch. You can't have everything. Um, you want the guy to work and support the family, okay. Well, sometimes it's going to be a lot of work, and sometimes it's not going to be necessarily that easy. On the other hand, if you want more time, then he's going to have to work less, and he'll be making less money. I mean, it's that simple. Uh, it's all. I've encountered many bored housewives in my time, and oof, the complaints of this sort are ubiquitous and frequent, and they don't get it, you know. Reminds me of this old story that Girl Writes What told about this guy who was, I think, I don't know, working oil platforms in Canada, and but the wife was annoyed that he was never around, and so they decided to sort of downsize their lifestyle so he'd be around more and work less, and then, well, lo and behold, she was very unhappy. I mean, it, it's one of the reasons why I could never. I mean, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but can you imagine being together with someone who's just never content, whatever the status quo might be? Maybe things are like this. No, I don't want that. Then you swap things up. Then they want things back. It's just um, I, from a personal perspective, I can't fathom how any man would want to deal with that. And I think ultimately, it just a lot of guys I know who sort of swallow the red pill but still want children. They just resign themselves to it. Like, I just got to deal with that. Oh well, because they don't have a choice. They're not looking at it through rose-tinted glasses anymore, I can assure you. But they're just like, what do we do? Guess got to deal with it.
Yeah, I see this all the time, and even guys that aren't even red pill, just the common statement I hear for guys who have gone through the whole process of getting married and having children is, well, I had a kid out of it, and the kid's my world. Which, I mean, fine. I'm glad that you appreciate your child and you're trying to build, a strong bond with them and trying to mold them to be a good person and whatnot. But at the same time, if that's really all you can say, and this is for the most part invariably all I hear is that they're not they're not satisfied with the relationship that they have with the wife, but they're glad they got a kid out of it.
Yeah.
And I could say almost invariably, this is all I ever hear of. And it just doesn't seem like something that anyone would purposely put themselves into, but it definitely is just the norm.
Well, the drive to reproduce, it's arguably one of the strongest out there. Most people
Right, right.
have it. I can't say I ever had it, but yeah, it's just this, had to go.
I'm more inclined towards carbohydrates. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, there are other inclinations too, but yeah, sure. But most people, if you're not, then you're probably more atypical, sure. But a lot of guys want offspring. I mean, their organisms tend to want to reproduce and replicate themselves. And they're willing to put up with a whole bunch of BS in order to get that done. Now, setting aside the fact that there's so many scenarios where they might lose their children, the children might become weaponized. It, but yeah, they just want that, and so they just deal with it. And I that though I think probably is a much healthier way to go about it than going in blindly because you think that there's some, I don't know, some magical love thing floating about, and that's why that's that's why that's why you want to get married and all this stuff. Um, I think that a guy who's red pilled, who's aware of these things and consciously goes in, that's a lot better, and he's a lot better off than some guy who's just lovey-dovey and he just decides to have a kid. Um, there's, I don't think marriage is functional in that sense unless you're just profoundly ignorant about, the way you behave as a man, the way women behave. And there are a lot of people who just don't know. I remember some time back, I was watching this I put myself through it, this almost 3 hour discussion on the quote unquote philosophy of divorce by some University of Chicago professor of philosophy, so pretty prestigious. And she actually didn't have the word for it. I wonder why women always want their men to improve, but men are content with women just, leaving women the way they are. It's so mysterious. I mean, this is a professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Okay, it's maybe not her field, but she doesn't get that. And ultimately, the reason why she decided to divorce her husband, who was also there, they're quote unquote friends now, but um, it, yeah, if you're gonna do it, and I tell every guy who really, really wants to do it, that you can't go in blind. Now, and if knowing this stuff about yourself and women gets to the point where that so demotivates you from even wanting to get married in the first place, well, maybe that's telling you something, right? Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, if your idea of the whole dynamic was predicated on basis that this idealized romantic notion of, I don't know, I guess generally some seemingly altruistic mother figure, it doesn't add up. And this is definitely not. I actually been thinking about lately, because I saw a video regarding it was a gentleman who had some other comorbid things, but he was a antisocial personality disorder, and he was basically just describing his interactions with people, and it was very reminiscent of basically how women interact with men. Um, and that basically just kind of made me go to the whole DSM-5, the whole psychology diagnostic manual for looking into these type of disorders. And basically, what I found, it's a pretty brief section for antisocial personality disorder, but it just goes into like impairments in self function, identity. It's like egocentrism, self esteem derived from personal gain. So, in the context of a woman, it could be, latching onto a high status guy, self direction, goal setting based on personal gratification, empathy, lack of concern for feelings, needs, or suffering of others, lack of remorse after hurting or mistreating people. All these things are just very reminiscent. And of course, I don't expect that if they were to come to terms with, okay, well, the contemporary female does display these type of traits, that they would say that, oh, well, that means that they're antisocial. They probably change the definition, but it was just something I kind of took interest in lately.
Mm. What in particular about it do you find fascinating? The antisocial
Well,
stuff, yeah.
I had never much looked at it in the past, but just a specific YouTube video where the guy was basically explaining that he had this disorder and his daily life interaction with people and the exploitation, and because he can't feel very much, he's not very empathetic. He gets a sense of power in manipulating other people's emotions, and basically just how women interact with each other from a very early age, and then going on and utilizing these tactics on men. And of course, a lot of men don't really know what to do about it. Um, it just seemed really reminiscent of that and some of the corollaries of Bruford's law. So, looking at that, it just seemed really reminiscent of how women interact. And I mean, just like anything else, if we were to find out that, okay, based on how women naturally interact with each other, they would be antisocial, that just wouldn't be something that would fly. I mean, even like the writing that I sent you, some of the stuff that I made, I had submitted that previously to, like, I don't know, at least 5 academic journals, and all of them pretty much gave me the same response, which was that, oh, this is interesting, but we feel it would be better suited to a different academic journal. So a lot of this stuff just, it will never actually be accepted, as I'm sure we're all aware, which I find to be very, very unfortunate.
Yeah, it. I mean, it's kind of murky territory when you sort of describe women's personalities as necessarily antisocial. I mean, there's certainly an element of sort of light solipsism or solipsism light, where everything's somehow a reflection of her own world and how things fit in there. Um, but I think distinct from antisocial behavior, women are very, very interested in maintaining, I guess, social harmony and some degree of there's why you see these gatherings of these gaggles of women drinking cocktails or coffee, and they're offering each other fake compliments about their outfits and just so pretending to get along. Which, in contrast to, I think, highly antisocial behavior, to me, um, describes even, well, greater social dependency or what have you, and interacting with people. Just because women feel the need to have networks. Whether they actually like the people in networks is, well, completely separate question. But and so they go through this rigmarole and the motions of, yeah, again, paying fake compliments to people and what have you. It's something men just typically don't do. Um, it's very, very I mean, Colton always jokes when women don't have friends, they have frenemies. It's very, very difficult, at least in uh, my book, to determine whether or not a woman's actually fond of her friends or not. I mean, I guess, um, you know, but it's because it can turn on a dime. I've seen it happen. So
No, definitely.
the possibility that there's some elements of that in women, sure, but I think that just to be fully antisocial and because they're very sensitive to their own stuff. That's the other thing. I mean, typically highly antisocial behavior, the guy, as far as I know, or because he's usually a man, but whatever, the person is himself not very sensitive or emotional, whereas women typically are hyper. So at least in this context, um, it kind of all falls in the category of sort of the darker personality traits of human beings in general, and specifically women. We just don't explore really. We don't talk about these things, the negative stuff that can come along with from women, but it's definitely there. And I think that probably this stuff, specifically the really dark stuff, won't be explored just because it's not worth the risk. Um, Although sometimes I wonder, as you well know, in some of the research, there's been research on how how women how women act out aggression, and typically they do it through reputational damage and things like that.
Right,
So
right.
it's quite different from men. And you know, I'm sure you know Diana Fleischman. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah, she's probably the only. I mean, she's not the only one. Certainly the most vocal female in Evo Psych, and she's pretty willing to address some of the stuff and talk about this. I think she has a much greater sense of awareness than a lot of the academics and people out there. But on the question of Japan, we hear all these stories. I guess the basic questions are how bad is it? Is a sort of quote unquote loveless, sexless life a very normative thing there by now?
Oh yeah, definitely. Even when I was taking a sexology course, the teacher was saying you could basically go on a train and kind of just point out about five people and say like sexless, sexless, having sex, sexless, and so it definitely is. And there's varying reasons for this, but a lot of people just find it to be at least from some of the research, they find it to be rather tedious. There's also the work environment.
Yeah.
Also, just and it actually tells you a lot. I actually had a feminist teacher, and she actually said that hypergamy is rampant in Japan. So that kind of tells you a lot. But
Really? Huh.
yeah, it was pretty interesting. But also, she went through a YouTube list, and Karen Strong popped up, so that might say
Oh,
something as well.
right.
Um,
Makes sense.
so
Ye-
yeah, sexlessness here. Um, the way that people pair bond, a lot of people, it's generally through friends, and then they'll pair bond, and it just seems to be something that they feel that they just kind of need to do as a check in the box.
hmm.
And people, they don't seem to be very invested. I mean, it's not invariably so, but a lot of people just, it's just something that they just do. Also, a lot of people aren't having but one child, and there's something called I believe it's called kawanoji, which in the household, the kanji kawa, which means river, is basically just three lines, and this is generally the formation of how the family will sleep. And what I came to find out was that when a family has a child, generally what ends up happening is it'll be the mother, the child, and then the husband, and they all sleep in the same room. Of course, this is not very conducive to any type of active sex life. But then also on top of that, in some cases, the parents might sleep in different rooms, or the guy might sleep on a couch because he needs to leave to go to work and he doesn't want to be disruptive to the family. But then also on top of that, you have just the abundance of alternative options here in Japan for satiating any type of sexual need. So a guy who's high status, it's kind of expected that he's going to stray a little bit from the relationship. He might go to what's called a kabakuda, which is basically just we call them like buy me drink bars in English, where you may go and it's Japanese women and they'll pay you attention, but you have to pay for it. And they get some type of money based on if you buy drinks and whatnot. I actually used to live with one of those type of girls, and interesting lifestyle. Um, then you also have different places such as let's say you want to act out the fantasy of I don't know, groping some girl on a public bus, there's a place for you to go and do that. So they pretty much any type of fantasy that you would have, there's some niche location where you can get it satiated.
Yeah. It's funny, in my old age, I kind of, the idea of sex, it does seem rather, to me as well, rather burdensome, just sort of, it's just a lot of work. Um, not, not something that's ever promoted in the West, but I think the Japanese are onto something there.
No, I would definitely agree with that. And but also the research, it didn't actually specify whether it was predominantly the men or the women saying that it was tedious.
Mm,
And just based on what we already know with women's attraction and, you know, opportunistically latching on to some guy, chances are what it comes down to is they pair with some guy that satiates their long term strategy, but not the short term. So in that sense, they probably quote unquote put their best foot forward in order to get into the relationship, potentially became resentful over time for having to commit to a lot of acts, maybe even sex that they weren't interested in with that particular guy in order to tie him into being committed to a relationship long enough to get married. So I think that just happens cross culturally, even though I haven't really seen any research specifically on that subject.
mm. And would you say that in the current year, 2020, that something like the majority of, say, 30 something below Japanese people, men and women, just are not terribly interested in marriage?
I would say that the women are still interested in marriage. In fact, there was an anthropological study that looked at basically women who are of marriage age, and I think it was predominantly like older, like maybe in like 30s or whatnot. And they said that over 80% of them were still interested in finding some type of relationship. So it seems that predominantly it's women that want the invested marriage and the commitment from the some type of significant other. And it just like other places, you have Japanese women marrying themselves and doing all these things, and you have factors such as herbivore men, you have hikikomori, and herbivore men, as everyone's heard about. That just, I guess, to provide some clarity with regards to herbivore men in Japan, it varies, and it's actually hard to pinpoint what they actually are because they became sensationalized in Japanese media, and a lot of it just due to older Japanese generation being upset because quote unquote men weren't men anymore and they weren't manning up to taking on a lot of the responsibilities in society, and that was something that basically any guy that's not taking on responsibility in Japan and not doing the traditional salaryman route and marrying and whatnot would take on. But what ended up happening was in some magazines, they were it basically switched from women trying to beautify themselves and trying to find ways to you know have the guy put themselves in a situation in order to get the guy, and then it switched to basically this is how you get a herbivore man, because these are generally guys that they may wear makeup and do a lot of beautifying techniques, and a lot of these women are trying to find that type of guy. And you'll even see this in what we call the host culture, which hosts are the opposite of hostess, where you have a guy who gets paid to interact with women. And they're generally guys that have the hair all done up. They might have their nails painted, may wear makeup and do all these things. And a lot of women are very much into this, just like they are into the whole Korean pop culture. Um, then there's hikikomori, which are the recluse of Japan. And a lot of these guys, they dealt with some type of a defeat earlier in life, and after that defeat, they end up becoming a recluse, not really wanting to interact, and generally staying in their room and maybe going out at like 4 in the morning to a convenience store in order to get food as opposed to interacting with anybody. And all these people together in Japanese society just think basically they're not contributing to very much of the economy. They're not going the traditional salaryman route and getting married and doing all these things. So a lot of people view it as a bad thing.
Is there any active attempt on the part of the government to sort of counter that in some way?
To my knowledge, no. No, I've just seen guys that could potentially be herbivore men. They're just guys that maybe wear makeup and they try to beautify themselves, and they're generally around women. And a lot of these guys, the idea has been that these guys are afraid of relationships with women, but some of them seem that they're completely fine with being around women and whatnot. Just they don't date.
Hmm.
Um, so with that, there really doesn't seem to be anything that the government can do at this point. But who knows? In the future, they might try to implement something.
Yeah, I mean, I know they tried. Um, well, there are things they can do, obviously, to quote unquote encourage more reproduction and marriage, but it's not. Who knows if it's actually going to work? It's very hard to coerce this sort of thing because it's typically very organic. Um, and in a way, in their own way, these guys who are kind of isolating, obviously the defeat or not, they're not. I mean, the salaryman lifestyle is not pleasant, so why would they want to live that anyway?
No, definitely. I've definitely met many a guy that their parents, like the father and maybe the grandfather was some form of salaryman, and they were just like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to work part time,
Hmm.
and I make enough money in order to do that. Which also could shed light on, you know, partially why a lot of men aren't getting married. And it might just be the same thing with the West, where women don't view these men as economically viable options because they are working part time.
Yeah,
I haven't seen any actual research on that, but it really wouldn't surprise me that it's the same in Japan.
yeah. I think on a final point, there. Well, this has been the case for years, but and I still hear about it. But for some reason, many men have been convinced that depending on the country you go, whether it's Japan or China or Russia or the U.S., women are sort of somehow fundamentally different. And you go some other place and you're not dealing with women anymore. You're dealing with just well, you're dealing with women, but they're so different that they might as well just be a different species. Um, Always forgetting that women are women. There's a reason why these behaviors are universal because they were beneficial to women in the past. That's why you see them in every group of women across the globe. And I don't know. I've never, for some reason, a lot of guys are still just very much enamored of this idea that if they would go to East Asia or wherever, Eastern Europe, they're going to find some woman who's just fundamentally different. Um, but alas, the reality is not going to happen. And what I tell every one of these guys is the best way, if you really, really want to have a quote unquote successful marriage, one that doesn't end in divorce or whatever, you have to make her dependent on you. Go someplace where it's relatively poor, where she's dependent on your resources, where she doesn't have a lot of options, because women are as loyal as their options are. And yeah, maybe if you never leave. I've seen a couple guys do this, went to the Philippines or some rural area of Southeast Asia. And yeah, I mean, questionable whether or not they really want to live that lifestyle, right? But still. Um, so yeah, that's what you can do basically. And a lot of these guys, they don't realize that that's how far you need to go to make it quote unquote work. Because if you end up just going to any major urban environment, you're gonna have the same problems, and women are women. If you want her to stay around, make sure she has no other options and she's dependent on you. I and I'm not for or against that, but that's the reality. If you want quote unquote security in marriage, well, that's what you need to do.
Yeah, it's basically the evolutionary derived tendencies are they're going to be omnipresent. It's just it's going to exist on a spectrum, just like personality disorders. It's going to be on a spectrum. So if the environment facilitates doing that, like in the West right now, and facilitates all this, what's the term usually used? With regards to hypergamy, rampant hypergamy or something like that.
Runaway hyper.
Runaway
Yeah.
hypergamy, right, right. Yeah, if it facilitates that, then of course. Japan facilitates definitely facilitates hypergamy. You have women running around in Gucci bags, and there's Lamborghinis going around and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, it's not going to be very. It's not going to be very much different. It's just going to be the environment. But yeah, it is, I guess, sad to say that you would have to go to some specific location where she would have to be dependent on you.
Yep. And maybe that's a tough pill to swallow, but that is kind of how it is. It's that if you want to be married, you want to succeed that, and you want a sort of more or less a guarantee of that, go to some poor area of the third world, and yeah, she'll probably stick around in all likelihood. But otherwise, it's a roll of the dice, unfortunately. And
Yeah,
these guys got to just be aware of that.
yeah. It's not to say that she wouldn't cheat, but given that you would be the financial provider, she would definitely be more inclined to stick around with you. And without remorse, I know, like in the Philippines, given the real religiosity of that given environment, people aren't divorcing. But with regards to infidelity, I mean, we have to take in consideration like ovulatory shifts. So you know, um, woman's fertile, she's going to be more inclined to try to pair off with someone who displays basically Chad genetic material. And then this has been shown in multiple studies. That just seems to be the case. And if you're a guy who is paired to one of these women and during her fertile period, you do not exhibit these traits, she's going to be more inclined to, yeah, deviate. She's going to become less attracted to you, less sexually responsive. So that's also something you would definitely have to take into consideration. So I guess it's not even guaranteed. I mean, yeah, you may have her stick around, but it's not to say that she's not still sleeping with someone else.
Yep. Oh, exactly. I mean, it's there's no perfect scenario here with marriage, so or anything for that matter. But yeah, um, that's the reality. I hope this message, that particular message, because it's been after years of saying, guys still don't get it. That they think that I don't know. It's really the environmental conditions that are going to determine it. So relative poverty, relative dependency, those are the things. And going to a wealthy place, whether it's east or west, is probably not the best option. I'd say. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss, or a thing something that was on your mind, perhaps?
At this current, no, I think we covered some good ground, man. I think that was a good talk, and I really hope that this reached everyone and they really take this into consideration and maybe even go down a further rabbit hole looking into evolutionary research. I definitely think educating yourself is a good step, and sad to say, but seeing what you're up against with
Yeah,
regards to dealing with this, whether you're in some type of relationship or even if you're just dealing with women at work.
yeah, absolutely. And I can't tell you how valuable it's been just retrospectively. I used to work in an office, and unfortunately, there were a lot of women in the office, and it was difficult at times. But I understand now why certain things happened and what have you. So yeah, it can be very enlightening for sure. Okay, everyone, thank you for tuning in. It was good to have this discussion, and hope you're well, keeping healthy, and I will check you out later if I'm still alive next time. Take care. Bye bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.